Hello, I am Jennifer Hermes Nastu, Content Director for Environment and Energy Leader, and I want to thank everyone for joining today for our Environment and Energy Leaders live webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by ISN, and I am excited to introduce our speakers. Today, I'm welcoming Joe Schlosser, VP of Corporate Opportunities, Ryan Rodriguez, Senior Group Supervisor of ESG, and Zoe Bolak, ESG Specialist. So welcome all of you, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'm excited to have you and excited to just hear your experience. So we'll get started in just a minute, but first I wanted to thank everyone who's joining us live and to extend a large thank you in advance to those who will be watching us on demand. We appreciate everyone joining us. So today we're talking about value chain considerations and expectations in terms of ESG. For many organizations, deconstructing their ESG goals to identify key performance indicators and to set milestones, as we know, it can be a challenge. And it requires the assistance of multiple stakeholders and departments, and adding an additional layer of complexity is the fact that that also includes coordinating with stakeholders from outside the organization, especially in the value chain. It's an important topic, and I know it's something that our readers and viewers are interested in learning more about, and there's a lot to cover. So we'll just jump in. Let's talk first about materiality. Actually, you know what, you guys, I'm going to pause us. So before we get started, I would love to have you guys just give us a quick couple of sentences background about what you do. Joe, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, love to. Thank you, Jen, and thanks for having us. My name is Joe Schlosser, and I'm a vice president with ISN. I've been with the company about 6.5 years, and I'm responsible for some of our corporate and business development functions. One of the things that I do in my role is try to stay close to the market and some of the technologies and our customers and what's happening specifically in ESG, and trying to stay close to some of the different stakeholders and regulations that are happening within there and how it applies to our customers and our employees. Happy to be here. Ryan, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Ryan Rodriguez. I'm one of the certified safety professionals here on our health and safety team at ISN. I also am helping lead our ESG group alongside Joe here, and have the opportunity to hear a lot from our customers about what's taking place in their own organizations and how they're disseminating that information down throughout their value chain. Zoe?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Zoe Bolak. I'm an ESG specialist with ISN. I've been with the company for a little over a year now, and I support both Ryan and Joe as we work with our customer base in contractor supplier management, and specifically on the collecting and verifying of ESG related data. But really excited to talk to y'all today.
Great. Well, thanks. I am super excited to have you guys. And as I said, this is a big topic with a lot to cover. So let's jump in. Let's start first with talking about materiality. Joe, can you explain why materiality is so important, and how a company can assess their materiality? And then Zoe, maybe you can address in general what topics are most material to organizational success.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for asking. And it's such a key topic because materiality is not necessarily a new topic or a concept. It's really about understanding your organization and the factors that make an impact, whether that's financial or to kind of the broader environment. And really what it is understanding what is important and then using that information to prioritize your efforts, because it's impossible and nobody can be everything to every issue. You have to really understand what matters. And the more that you can focus on what's material, the more effective you're going to be in making an impact and adding value to your organization or the broader environment. And so organizations are thinking about materiality quite a bit nowadays. They're also thinking about the double materiality, things that impact both the enterprise and the overall impact to the world. And those are the types of issues that their stakeholders are interested in. And those stakeholders include employees, customers, investors, and the broader community, consumers. And so one of the things that we would recommend is certainly to understand what's material to you and use the frameworks that are available. A lot of companies start off with an assessment by surveying their stakeholders. So really trying to figure out what matters. Employees and customers are a great place to start, and suppliers, and then using that information to kind of build their plans off of some of the frameworks that are available.
Right. Great. You mentioned that some of the frameworks. Can you name a couple of those?
Yeah, like there's a SASB and GRI or some of those frameworks. And then there, I think generally, if you think about investors or public companies, there are public reporting frameworks. So SEC obviously has a framework for reporting, and there's some suggestions or that are being made around what is specific to environmental goals or emission goals that are kind of evolving topics. But there are lots of them. It can be confusing and complicated for a lot of organizations to understand what to use. But certainly, I think that's where industry works together to try to hone in on what matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those are definitely some places to start. Okay, so Zoe, maybe you can address what topics tend to be most material to organizational success.
Sure. So Joe mentioned a lot of this too. Those material topics can vary by industry and also vary down to the company level. So there's some high industry level standards, as you've mentioned. SASB is a good example, but there may be some topics that are really niche to specific companies. And so really understanding what is material, not only at an industry level, but at company level, is really important when you're looking at how that's going to impact organizational success. Greenhouse gas emissions are really the most common material topic right now. And that's just because there's a huge global focus on climate action. But there are many, many other common material topics across the board, including human rights, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and belonging, anti-corruption, bribery, other environmental metrics like water and waste reduction, and circular economy. But again, each of those are very niche to your own organization's needs and can differ widely.
Right. And one of the things, Joe, that you mentioned and that we're talking about today is, getting suppliers to participate. So I know that talking to them about materiality is one of the things that organizations can do, but what else do organizations, how else can they get suppliers to participate in ESG initiatives? Joe, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, there's certainly ways for leading organizations to establish and understand and get participation from the value chain. I think the key thing is to understand and assess what kind of information you have available. So, starting to think about what kind of information you're collecting from suppliers and your different processes, making sure that you have a good sense for what is material and that you're communicating that through your value chain so people understand not only what you want to collect or what you're trying to measure, but why. And then once you have a good assessment for the sort of where you are, and I think a lot of organizations are struggling to get to that point, frankly, they're still trying to figure out what that baseline is and where they stand today. Once they do have that information, then it's really a matter of setting goals and priorities that are reasonable and that are done in conjunction with what the supply chain can possibly do, because you can't necessarily disrupt your entire value chain over a goal, but you need to drive it and improve the performance in order for all of us to achieve the goals that we set forth. So as far as driving requirements, I think the best in class organizations, they really think about creating clear standards and making that transparent to the suppliers on what they're trying to measure, giving some mechanism for capturing that information. And then they're probably, in addition to just capturing it, also making sure that it's standardized in a way, because I think one of the challenges we see as you get down the value chain or suppliers in particular is that there's a lot of lack of education and understanding of what they're trying to measure, why it matters, and then how to input that. Because if you get bad data, it could really be difficult to drive towards a better outcome or goal.
You're right. And to announce your progress on those goals if you're not sure what progress you have made.
Right.
So we're talking about best-in-class organizations, and Ryan, I'd love to hear from you. What do some of these organizations have in common when it comes to meeting their ESG goals?
Yeah, definitely. So there's, like Joe and Zoe have both been talking about, every organization is different. It depends on their industry. It depends on who their stakeholders are and how they engage with those stakeholders. But of course, there are some common threads. There's some trends that I think Joe just did a pretty nice job kind of touching on there. I think one thing that I would talk about specifically is kind of that focus on partnerships with contractors and suppliers that are going to be mutually beneficial for both the hiring client organization, the buying company, if you will, as well as the folks that are supplying to them. A good example of that kind of mutual beneficial would be a greenhouse gas emission reduction effort. So typically that's going to start at the buying organization, the ones that are going to commonly be publicly traded and have hundreds or thousands of employees that they're working with, a wide stakeholder audience that they're trying to appeal to. And as they work towards those efforts, it does require the value chain to work with them towards meeting those goals. If you're setting a carbon neutral goal or you're setting a net zero goal, you have to be able to rely on your contractors and suppliers as you work to reduce those emissions, as a good example. You also have to be able to understand where other risks as it relates to ESG, it's not just environmental, lie. So you have to be able to identify where you might have a risk for corruption, bribery, modern slavery. All of those things are not just staying at the buying organization, but it does require that coordination with the contractors and suppliers. And one thing that you have to do is be able to incorporate that into things like contracts, especially when you're working with smaller organizations. You think of companies that have fewer than 100 or even fewer than 10 employees. Chances are they do not have a full-time ESG or sustainability professional on staff. That is going to be one more hat that an individual is wearing. And so we have to be able to guide those organizations through things like contractual agreements or RFPs to identify those different data points that need to be tracked on a periodic basis and help the buying organization understand how people are progressing year over year as they try to meet their various goals around carbon reduction or modern slavery, those sorts of things.
Right. Great. Thank you. So I'd like to shift focus a little bit and talk about transparency. How does operational transparency throughout the supply chain influence ESG performance? Joe, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I would say it's an interesting topic because this is something ISN's business for over 20 years. I think one of our key successes that we've built a model where buyers and suppliers work together and lead to better outcomes, better performance for industry. And one of the most critical ways to do that is through transparency. It's through creating a transparent scoring mechanism from the buyer that is clear to the supplier what they have to do to perform and gain that work of the buyer and work together on, and that allows the suppliers to really do better. So when you're sort of measuring and it's a black box, you're not sure how to do better or what to invest in. It's really hard on the supplier side to make those improvements and understand that. And it's also hard for you as the buying organization to judge as criteria in choosing a supplier if it's not clear whether the suppliers are, how to compare those suppliers and whether suppliers are achieving what you expect of them. So kind of simply put, transparency is probably the most essential mechanism for driving improved supplier performance. And that can be on any topic. We've seen it in areas like health and safety or general compliance or even financial risk and other things like that. But I think ESG is just another form of that, and helping companies understand where they stand, what the expectations are, and then how to get there. They'll figure it out in a lot of ways, but you can work with them. But the first step is knowing where you stand and what the expectation is, so you understand what you have to aim for.
Right. That makes sense. So it's really one of the most important elements in working with your supply chain.
Yeah, crucial.
So Zoe, I'd love to hear from you again. Let's talk about, in terms of this topic as a whole, why is it important to address, for example, scope 3 emissions when we're talking about supply chain, and then when we're talking about, climate change as a whole?
That's a great question. So in the last 18, 24 months, there's been this tremendous shift around businesses assessing not only how they influence climate change, but also how climate change is really going to affect them and their daily operations and their bottom line as time goes on. And so collectively, there's intense pressure for all these organizations to start taking action and stay below the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their 1.5 degree warming threshold. So that's what everyone's aiming for when they aim for the net zero, right? But with the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions, we're talking anywhere from 60 to 95% of company emissions in that scope 3 bucket. It's critical to look at that piece to reach net zero and strive for net zero. And it can be incredibly difficult to tackle. It's extremely complex. The greenhouse gas protocol has 15 different categories associated with that. And products and services, purchase of products and services is just one of those categories, but a lot of times it can account for a huge majority of it, but it is such a complicated piece of it. So it's really, really important to not only have good data on that scope 3 piece, because you can't improve or try to reach net zero if you don't know where you are today. So it's really important to baseline and have concrete information before, taking those next steps and figuring out, okay, these are our top emitters. How can we work with them? How can we partner with them? As Ryan discussed earlier, those partnerships are key so that collectively, as a human race, we can meet that net zero goal.
Right. So, yeah, one of the things that you mentioned is, obviously how complicated all of this is. And so I'm curious about education. Ryan, do you have thoughts on ESG education, how it contributes to the success of an organization's overall goals?
Yeah, absolutely. Education is really the crux of it. You have to be able to be speaking the same language in order to really make any progress on these goals. So when we talk about these terms, scope 1 and 2 or 3 emissions, there are very clear definitions for those things when you use items like the greenhouse gas protocol to help you define it, help you to categorize your emissions and work towards it. Now, I mentioned earlier, a lot of the organizations that you probably work with, or buying organizations work with, are small companies. They don't have the background, they don't have the degrees, the PhDs in sustainability to really feel comfortable categorizing some of these things. And you need some assistance to get there and to be able to identify where this particular item should be categorized or how you should get started tracking these different things. So as you work as a buying organization to disseminate that information to your supply chain, technology is a great way to do that. You can do things like what ISN has been doing for our customers. We hold webinars that discusses what some of these basic definitions are, how to get started tracking your environmental emissions, whether it's through waste receipts, whether it's through collecting your gasoline receipts or diesel receipts for your fleet, all of those different things. It's pretty easy to say, once I understand the basic concept of it and how do I get started, you can create a spreadsheet on your work computer that just tracks some of these different items. And as you work day by day, you get more comfortable with it and you're able to see the bigger picture as time goes on. So I think, again, education just is absolutely essential. You can rely on your own organization's sustainability education if you have them, or if not, there's lots of available resources for you to share with companies that you work for, your own organization. Providing those different training opportunities, whether it's using organizations like Joe mentioned earlier, the SASB resources that they have publicly available, Global Reporting Initiative, all of these different companies that put this information out on the internet for people to soak up and absorb into their own organization to help push them in the right direction. Maybe my last comment on that is It does seem intimidating sometimes to these smaller organizations, and I would say it is not a requirement to have some in-depth knowledge of these items to start your ES journey. You will continue to learn as time goes on and as your organization matures, especially as it relates to the management systems overall. And that's where you're going to start to see the progress be made.
Interesting. I appreciate that point, because I often wonder, how on earth do companies get started, because it is such a big, complicated topic. So it's good to know that they're not expected to have all the knowledge all at once. So we talked about transparency, we talked about education, things that organizations have in common. We're almost out of time, but is there anything else that you guys want to touch on briefly before we go?
Maybe just one comment, Jen. I think from a technology perspective, there has been a huge proliferation of different providers and companies that have come out over the past few years. Some of them focused on internal accounting, some of them servicing the needs or the goals of investors that manage portfolios or companies, and some of the companies that are focused, like ISN, a little bit more on the supply chain and how to capture some of that information. I think it's exciting to see some of the development. I think there'll be lots of innovation in this space over the years. It can also be overwhelming and confusing. Some of these are really technical models. I would just say, my sort of takeaway is that I don't think there's an easy button. So, I think some of the providers mention upload and in 5 minutes you've got a full report and apply to frameworks. That's probably not realistic, particularly as it relates to capturing supply chain information. And some of the things that we've done historically are going to be relied on, which is just collecting good collection of information and engagement with the supply chain. You're going to have a hand in reviewing and verifying what you're seeing and making sure that it's developed and the data you're collecting is done consistently so it can actually be relied upon. And so I think technology will be an interesting one to watch and stay close to over the next few years as more regulations or requirements come out, more companies will adopt. And then the last piece would be that I think it's really important industries work together. Market leaders need to work together to drive performance within their stakeholders. And that's really what's going to get suppliers and the supply chain and value chain to get better, is getting the top organizations within each industry to get together and help make this a possibility.
Right. Interesting. Those are, I'm glad that you added those couple additional points. I agree that technology is exciting to watch, and looking forward to how organizations do work together to drive some of these changes is pretty exciting too. So thank you guys so much. That's all the time we have today. I could ask you a million more questions, but hopefully we can have another conversation in the future. So Joe, Ryan, and Zoe, thanks again for joining us. You shared a lot of great information that I know our viewers will find interesting and useful. And thank you to our viewers for joining us today. We appreciate you tuning into this episode of Leaders Live, and we will see you all next time. Thanks.